So in this video, we're going to be talking about the Queen's Gambit, specifically the position that could happen after d4, d5, where simply, white controls the center, black also fights with their equal share in the center, and white plays the move c4. So this is known as the Queen's Gambit. And so we're faced here with a junction where white is trying to offer the c pawn, so that if we capture on c4, white has the option of playing either the move e3, or the move e4. So in either case, white will build quite a nice center and will have a small edge in these kind of positions, though of course this is completely playable, and with correct play, black should be able to get a decent game here. But yeah, like besides e4, also the move pawn to knight f3 followed by e3 makes a lot of sense. And yeah, but in this video specifically, I don't really want to discuss that. I want to discuss the move pawn to e6, which is more principled from a sense that you're kind of supporting your center. You're not allowing white to, get more pawns in the center. And at the same time, you have the problem of this bishop on c8 suddenly. So in all of the Queen's Gambit decline openings, you will notice that your c8 bishop kind of runs into some problems because it's not able to go on this diagonal anymore. Another option, if you don't want to do that, is that you can play the move c6, which allows for the option of your bishop to go out over here. But at the same time, if you need to be really careful about bringing your bishop out early, because your b7 pawn can be undefended and moves like queen b3 can come. So yeah, just a bit of an outline. After the move pawn to e6 here, white is faced with the decision though. They can either play the move knight f3 or knight c3 here. Generally, they want to delay where they put this bishop, because if it goes to f4 now, we can transpose to many of the lines in the Queen's Gambit anyways after, let's say, knight f6, and then white can play the move either cd5, knight c3, or knight f3, or pawn to e3, and then they will all generally transpose into one of the knight moves, right? So in this position, let's talk about the first move, knight c3. And it seems at first glance that there's not a big difference whether you play knight c3 or knight f3 first, but there's actually a big difference, is that after knight c3, and you play the move knight f6, just defending your center, white has one option to either take on d5 and then go bishop g5. And this is known as the exchange variation, which is very popular at actually all levels in chess. And yeah, black needs to know some stuff to equalize, but overall, black is completely fine. Their position is very solid. There is the threat of bishop takes f6, followed by taking the pawn on d5, which is why black plays the move c6 first, just defending the d5 pawn. And they can develop in many different ways. And we're going to be looking at one game looking at this. Instead of c takes d5, it's also possible after knight c3 to play the move knight f3. However, this can easily transpose to the position after white plays the move knight f3 in this position. And after knight f3, we play knight f6, simply developing. And then here, white can play the move knight c3 or a lot of other moves. After the move knight c3 in this position, we enter the Queen's Gambit declined like a big position here where black has a lot of moves as well. For example, in this position, black could go for the move c6, which is known as the semi-Slav defense, because you are building this pawn triangle. And even though it does defend the center quite solidly, at the same time there are some problems with this bishop on c8. So one way to try to liberate it is that at some point, when allowed, black will take on c4 and then play the move b5 followed by bishop b7, and that is one of the ways to solve the problem of this bishop. And instead of that, the move bishop b4 is also quite popular, known as the Rogozin defense. It gets a bit more like the bishop is quite active here, pinning the knight, but at the same time, white has this annoying move queen e4 check, which forces the knight to come to c6 if you don't want to lose the bishop. And so in general, we know that in the Queen's Gambit, both black and white kind of want to make sure their pawn stays flexible here so that it can either advance to c6 or pawn to c5 in the future. So with the knight on c6, it's a bit of a concession, you could say. So either way, this is possible. Just one of the lines in the Rogozin, but instead we're going to be talking about the move bishop e7 here. This is known as the orthodox or just a standard Queen's Gambit declined. And from this position, white also has a lot of moves. One problem of taking on d5 here is that after e takes d5, you open up the bishop, and so black can develop really freely here. For example, they can play pawn to c6 and then go with the bishop to f5 and get a very fine position. Instead of that, white has the move bishop g5 here. Known as just known simply as the bishop g5 Queen's Gambit declined. And here I will recommend a move which starts out with h6, just kicking away the bishop. And black is faced with two possible moves here. White can either take on f6, and after bishop takes f6, play a move like e3. And it seems strange, like, because we understand the bishop here is an important asset for both sides, why is white giving up the bishop here? It's because with this bishop on f6, it isn't optimally placed, because it stands on this diagonal which isn't open currently, and so this bishop, you could say, is a bit misplaced, though black is doing fine certainly here. Instead of bishop takes f6 though, there's also the move bishop h4, simply retreating. And from this position, I will recommend a system without developing this knight to d7 first. Oftentimes the knight goes to d7, but I want to delay that. I want to recommend castling here, and after white defends the center with e3, and also opens up their bishop on f1, the move b6 here. This is known as a Tartakower variation, a favorite of Boris Spassky, the world champion before Bobby Fischer. And with this move, it simply prepares to solve the problem of the light-squared bishop to go to b7. So if white isn't careful, for example, if they play a move like bishop d3, which is certainly playable, I like simply taking on c4, forcing the bishop to move once more, and then developing with the bishop to b7. And I think in general, even though white has more pawns in the center, black is managing to get the bishop on this long diagonal, which solves one problem of the bishop. And also, white has been forced to develop the bishop once, and then to move twice, actually, in this position. So instead of bishop d3, the move bishop e2 can also transpose after d takes e4. But there's also a couple other moves. For example, white can take on d5, and the point is that we want to take back with the knight, so that now the bishops can be exchanged, so that this pin is no longer annoying. As we see, this pin is quite annoying, so we will kind of want to liberate our position. After bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, white will take on d5 and say that if you ever put the bishop on this square on b7, which it normally wants to go to, it's kind of blocked by your own pawn. So oftentimes the bishop will go to e6, and we'll see a game later on in this line. So white also has the move rook c1, which leads to a different kind of play, but in general, black is doing fine here. So that's the bishop g5, queen's gambit declined. Instead, there's also the move bishop f4 here, just simply known as the bishop f4, queen's gambit decline. And from this position, I would like to recommend castling, and after pawn to e3, go with the move knight bd7, I believe, or even the move c5. I think c5 is what I will recommend. We'll look at a couple games in this variation, where black is not developing the knight to d7, so that later the knight can often go to c6. And what ends up happening is that oftentimes black will end up with an isolated pawn on d5, let's say here, and then queen c2, and then here, yeah, even without, I mean, the main move here is queen a5, which we will be looking at. After rook d1, rook d8, or bishop e7, I believe. Yeah, I think bishop e7, and at some point white will take on d5 here. You know, even early on it's possible in this position to take on d5, and oftentimes we will get this isolated pawn position. Though with the bishops opened, this is kind of a decent position for black. So yeah, that's essentially covers what variations we will be looking at. So let's go to the first game actually. And of course, actually there's also one more line that I want to mention, is after c4, e6, knight f3, specifically knight f6, white has the option of going with the move g3. This is known as the Catalan, and it's very popular in the higher levels nowadays. Yeah, and white poses a lot of problems here, because if we ever take on c4, which it happens in a lot of positions, white will reign free with their bishop on this long diagonal. And so black has some problems to solve, although they are accepted to be doing very much okay. Okay, but we will just be looking at the exchange variation, Tartakower, and the bishop f4, queen's gambit declined. So let's look at the first game. This was played between Saleh, who is the grandmaster from the top grandmaster from UAE, against Magnus Carlsen. I believe this was played in an online event. And after d4, black starts out here with the move knight f6. So the benefit of this move order is that, you know, you always want your knight on f6 anyways. And after pawn to c4 and pawn to e6, black is actually ready to, after knight c3, to play the move bishop b4. And this is known as the Nimzo Indian. It leads to a completely different type of opening with many other variations. So, but instead, in this game, Carlsen decided to choose the move d5. And white here decided to take on d5, c takes d5, e takes d5, and go for the exchange variation with bishop g5. So yeah, after let's put a couple more moves on the board. Black defends the center with c6. White plays move e3. And here, the idea behind e3 is that we normally want to develop the bishop to f5. This is the ideal square. But if you play bishop f5 now, white has the option of going queen f3, attacking the bishop, and after we retreat with the bishop, white will take on f6. And we will enter this position after we trade off the queens, where black has the bishop pair here, but at the same time, they have a lot of problems to solve with these two, with these weaknesses. So this is playable, though a lot of people will find this unpleasant. So instead of bishop f5 here, the main move is to play the move bishop e7, simply developing and preparing to castle. And after bishop d3, now preventing bishop f5. Since now we've defended the knight on f6, we're ready to play bishop f5 in one go. Let's say if white plays the move knight f3, then now we can play bishop f5. And we are generally very happy with the exchange of the bishops here, because white's bishop, which normally reigns free on this diagonal, let's say on this diagonal, is no longer on the board. But in this position after bishop d3, black can play the move h6, just kicking the bishop away, and so we'll be happy to accept the bishop pair here. White normally plays bishop h4, and then black castles here. So black has castled, gotten their pieces out, but again, they have the problem of this knight on b8 here, which and also the problem with the bishop on c8 here, because it doesn't really want to go to g4 if it can be kicked with f3, and it can't go to f5. So the question is, how should black develop their pieces, right? So let's talk about this so-called Carlsbad structure, where white has the 2 pawns on the queen side here against black's 4 pawns on the queen side. And this is a typical Carlsbad structure we see often in the Queen's Gambit declined. And first, let's talk about why white delays the development of their knight on g1 here. Why doesn't it immediately go to f3? It's because white wants to have ideas in the future of playing the move f3 followed by e4, expanding in the center, which is why white delays the development and has the option of playing knight g to e2 instead of knight f3. And we can also talk about this pin, for example. Black generally wants to exchange these bishops because this pin is quite annoying, as we see even in the Tartakower. So how black often does that is by playing a move like knight e4, so that first off they're able to block the d3 bishop from reigning free on this diagonal, exchange the bishops, and eventually at some point bring the knight over to d6, even if allowed or if under pressure. Now the knight is actually very useful on d6 here. For example, after knight g to e2, if we wanted to bring this knight to d6 for a couple of reasons. First off, it controls the e4 square, so it kind of makes the idea of f3 e4 a bit more difficult to do. Another idea is that it prevents the typical idea of white has, known as a minority attack. What is a minority attack? The minority attack is what happens when white plays a move like rook b1 and tries to advance the pawn up the board to b4 and then b5, so that they're able to take on c6. And if black takes back with the pawn, then the c6 pawn becomes a weakness. Rook c1, knight e4, and even the draw squares on c5 are very weak. And besides that, if you take back after b4, b5, and you take back with the knight, then the d5 pawn simply becomes an isolated pawn. So that's the idea behind, two white's biggest plans in the Carlsbad structure. Which is why the knight on d6 is very useful to do that. The knight on d6 is also very useful to kind of support the idea of bishop f5, because we know that this bishop is kind of struggling. It doesn't really do a lot on e6 and can be actually a target to like knight f4. So instead we want to like bring this knight to d6, try to allow the move bishop f5, exchange the bishops, and get a fine game here. Another idea is also, as we mentioned, like rook e8 followed by knight e4 to blockade this bishop and just support our knight on e4 there. If it's threatened, then it can go back to d6. That's another idea. And about this knight on b8, actually, oftentimes on d7 it doesn't actually do a lot, because maybe it can go to b6 sometimes, especially if white has tried to go for this b4 advance, because as we see, one downside of the move b4 is that it weakens control over the c4 square. So oftentimes black can play the move knight d7, knight b6, and then occupy the c4 square. Another way to develop is actually also to play this move a5 to control the b4 square, so that later also the knight can go to a6 and either go to b4, especially when the queen is on c2 with the fork, or go to c7 and go to e6 later on to kind of develop and centralize. Another idea is actually with the knight on a6 is that it can actually support the c5 break. So these are just some of the big ideas in the Carlsbad, interesting ways to develop, and you just gotta get a feel for this kind of position and know some stuff. So in this game, black played the move knight e8. And if you exchange the bishops, then black is doing fine. After queen takes e7, let's say white castles, and then black brings the knight to d6. Black is ready to play the move bishop f5 to exchange these white's strong light squared bishop. So white can play the move queen c2 here, preventing bishop f5. And then now I like the move just simple knight e7, rook h to e1, and simply bring in the knight to f6 here. Yeah, black has some problems to solve after knight g3, threatening the move knight, preparing some occupation of the f5 square. But at the same time, with the knight on d6 and the bishop on c8 here, if a knight comes to f5, we can simply exchange all the pieces. So black can continue with h5 here and threaten maybe at some point to play the move h4. And yeah, black is doing very well here, though it is perfectly equal. So instead of bishop takes e7, white decided to keep more pieces on their board with bishop g3, and black played the move knight d6 here. This is perfect. The knight wants to go there. It's controlling e4, controlling b5, and preparing at some point to play the move bishop f5. So white played queen c2, preventing bishop f5. Now rook e8. White castles, and in this position, it's possible to prevent white from pushing b4. But in this position, it makes sense also to play bishop f8. So black is opening up the rook's path here. So now f3 is no longer possible since the e3 pawn becomes weak. Now in this position, white played a very logical move for rook a to e1, preparing the same idea of f3, e4 in the future. But it also helps to ask ourselves, what happens if white pushes the immediate b4, going for the minority attack? And it turns out that black can ignore this, because if we play a6, preventing b5, white can still push the pawn to a4. So in general, I don't really want to prevent this pawn from coming to b5 if it comes through anyways. So for example, after knight d7 here, just developing, after pawn to b5, black is just in time to support the queen side with the move knight b6. And so the knight on b6 here looks kind of strange, but we see that one downside of pushing the pawn to b4 is that the c4 square becomes weak because the pawn can no longer come to b3. And so we occupy this square on c4 later on. A sample line goes pawn to a4, supporting the b5 pawn, knight comes to c4, bishop takes d6 here is possible. So after the move bishop takes d6, white is preparing to push the pawn to e4. That's one of the ideas. And here, black will simply defend the center with bishop e6, which does allow the pawn to come to e5, but after bishop e4, black has their own set of counterplay here. For example, after b takes e6, we do have a weakness here on c6, as we often notice, but it can later advance to c5 and kind of chip away at white's center. So after, let's say, knight f4, we don't really want to give up this bishop because we need to defend the light squares here. Because if we exchange it off, then this bishop on d3 basically roams free on this diagonal. So instead, bishop d7, white can take on c4, d takes c4, and bring a knight to e4, attacking the c4 pawn. But in this position, analysis has showed that actually black is completely fine after the move c3. So the thing is that with this pawn on c3, it's tempting white into taking it. And after knight takes c3, we can actually blast open the center with c5. d5 is not possible because we will take the pawn on e5. So here the best move is knight c to d5. But now black will play rook c8, defending, putting some pressure on the queen here. And after queen comes to d3, black can even play the move queen g5. So now putting some pressure on the center, at some point the idea of breaking down white's center and then taking the pawn at e5 is possible. So white's best move here is rook a to c1, but black can support their bishop on b4 with the move a5. And black is doing okay here because the pawn on a4 becomes weak, black's queen is active, and the center, which used to be very strong, is suddenly under some serious pressure. So black is fine here. Let's go all the way back here. Instead of pawn to b4, this is why the move rook a to e1 is played. It's because white wants to focus on the f3 and e4 plan and not really think about the queenside play for now. Which is why in this position, black plays the move a5, which is again very multi-purpose. It prevents both the pawns from coming to b4 and also with the idea of bringing the knight to a6 here, because the knight on d7, if it goes to f6, white can still oftentimes push the pawn to e4 anyways. So with the knight on a6, it comes with a different set of ideas. White plays knight d1 with the idea of defending the e3 pawn so that f3 and e4 can be pushed through. Black plays knight a6, threatening knight b4 to win the bishop, and so white plays a3 here. And with the move a3, it just simply prevents knight b4. And here black, if you're asked to try to come up with a plan here, it's kind of difficult at first glance because you don't know where your bishop wants to go to. On e6, it's not really doing anything there. But Magnus developed here with the move bishop d7, which looks very passive at first. But the idea behind the bishop on d7 is actually, it's useful to control a lot of the queenside squares, especially the b5 square. Now, what do I mean by that? What does Magnus mean by that? After the move f3, black played the move rook c8 here. And with the intention that they actually want to support the c5 break, which is why the knight on a6 is very multi-purpose, because it can prepare the move c5. And it does allow bishop takes a6, but after b takes a6, black has the idea of bishop f5 next, and white is really missing their light squared bishop here. So this is not really good, even though it doubles our pawns. Instead, the move knight e to c3 was played, then now black breaks with c5. So this is exactly what they want. If you take on d5 now with the knight, then after c takes d4, moves, we're hitting the queen, we're hitting the pawn on e3, moves like bishop c6 are possible. Black is already better here. So instead, white gets out of the way with queen f2, and black defends the center with bishop c6 here. The bishop stays on this diagonal and also defends this pawn on d5, controlling the e4 square. And later we see after the move bishop f4 played in this position, which isn't really great. It tries to free up the g3 square for the queen. Better move would have been king h1, but we will see a similar idea as seen in the game, which is to continue with b5 next. And the point is that we see the bishop on c6 is suddenly very useful to support this b5 advance. So now it's actually possible to take this pawn by trading off the bishops. But in general, we're happy to see the exchange of some bishops for our knights, because that bishop is quite strong. So after queen takes d6 here, white can take on b5 in two different ways. If they take on b5 with the knight, then after queen to b8, hitting the knight, white can play a4, and then we can take on d4 here. So e takes d4 would lead to an isolated pawn on d4. So white would have some targets to kind of solve. So instead, knight takes d4 is a better move, hitting the knight on a6 here. But now knight c5 comes, and after knight takes c6. Okay, so first we're hitting the bishop, but we're also threatening to win the pawn on a4. So white should take on c6 here. We'll take on d3. White takes on b8 here, and this leads to mass exchanges. After we take on f2 with check, knight takes f2, rook takes b8. And after rook e2, black plays the move bishop c5. And we can see that all of black's pieces are very active here. The pawn on e3, we can see that despite white's main idea in the beginning was to kind of make it like to advance it forward and generate really a nice center. As a result, the pawn on e3 actually becomes weak in this position. So after rook f to e1, black can play the move rook b3 and actually have an advantage here. So it's quick to see that a lot of things can turn around really quickly here if black or white isn't careful. So that's if knight takes b5. If they end up taking on b5 with the bishop, then after we play the move knight c7, we're attacking the bishop, so they should probably take on c6. And here we have targets with the move rook b8 next to target the pawn on b2. We also have the idea of taking on d4, so that later white has another isolated pawn on d4. And if white ever takes on c5 here, then it activates our bishop, allowing us to target this e3 pawn. Let's say queen d2, and then rook e to d8. So with the possibility of d4 next, otherwise, just long term, this pawn on e3 is weak, this pawn on b2 is weak, and the knight on d1 is really misplaced. So we can see that black has no problems here, although they need to really play with a lot of activity here. So that's the possibility of king h1. Instead, the move bishop f4 was played, which actually allowed this move pawn to b5. First off, with the same idea that you can take the pawn, but we will get a lot of compensation after you exchange your bishop. So instead, knight e2 was played, defending the pawn on d4. But now black jumps in with knight c4, threatening knight d2. And after queen to g3, black had an improvement here. They played the move h5, which is fine, but instead king h8 would have been better, though it's understandable that after queen h3, just trying to maybe enter the h5 square, bishop d7, queen h5, a lot of complications can happen here, but essentially at the end of the day, even if this d5 pawn is lost, let's say after cd4, ed4, and king g8, even if this d5 pawn is lost, black will develop with the knight to c7. Exchanging here would be very, very bad, because at the end of the day, white has a lot of weaknesses to deal with in this position. Knight d2 is also coming. Let's say knight f4, knight d2 is also a big problem here. Actually, wait, no, knight f4 loses the knight, but knight g3 here would still run into problems after knight d2. So, yeah, a lot of problems to solve here. Instead of king h8, though, black played h5, which allows the move bishop g5, but black is fine after bishop e7. It does get a bit dicey here after, let's say, knight f4, hitting the h5 pawn. And yeah, black will have to push the pawn forward, queen comes to g4, queen to f6, queen to h5, and after black kicks away the queen, white has the move knight takes g6, going for a full piece sacrifice with the idea of going for a quick attack here. With the pawn coming to f5 and also knight coming to g4, the position is objectively equal, though it's very difficult to play for both sides. So that's the possibility. It's a very dangerous idea. But instead, queen h3 was played, but after g6, simply black's position is very solid. This bishop is no longer such a great piece. And so, yeah, the queen on h3 is also like kind of on the side of the board. And yeah, from this position, g4 is played, and then bishop d7, pinning the pawn. Queen g2, trying to open up the g file once g takes h5 is played. But now black closes up the position with h4 here. White plays g5, maybe at some point wanting to target this and isolate this h4 pawn. Said bishop g7 was played, targeting the center, and black gets a really good position. After king h1, knight d2 was played, just kind of breaking up the coordination of white's position a bit, and also preparing to advance the pawn to c4. Rook g1, c4, bishop c2, and now pawn to b4. So we can see that black is also, with the majority on the queen side here, gets a really, really good counterplay here. And white pushes e4, which is the idea of their entire play, but now black plays c3. And from this position, okay, you're supporting the knight on d2, not allowing it to be taken. After b takes e3 here, black actually had a winning move here, which is d takes e4. Pointing out that now if you take on d2, we'll take on f3 with the fork, so queen takes f3, and now bishop c6, simply winning the queen here. So black is simply winning. Instead, if you don't take on d2, if you take on e4 back, then the black has to move knight takes e4, winning back at least the pawn. Because now if you take the knight on e4, again, this runs into the same pin, with black winning as a result. Instead, if you play d5, black will simply develop queen e7, rook e8, and get some really, really strong pressure on the e file. So that would have won for black immediately, but b3 was played, and even though objectively this position is equal or closer to equality, eventually black managed to win. But yeah, that just covers the opening phase of this game, just what I kind of want to show from this exchange variation. A couple of the key ideas, where you want to put your pieces. This idea of the a5 followed by knight a6 is quite interesting, but also quite unusual in a lot of positions. But it is one of the key ideas in this variation. So yeah, let's move on to the next variation. Okay, so next let's look at the so-called Tartakower variation, also known as the Makagonov-Bondarevsky variation, according to Russian sources. But yeah, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be calling it the Tartakower variation. So yeah, let's look at this first game played by Efim with the black side, on the black side against Jan Timman. The game started with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop e7. So a different move order to try to prevent the entering in the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. For example, now the move with c takes d5 followed by bishop g5 is no longer possible. Though we did look at that, this system for black in the previous section. So instead of that, bishop e7 is an interesting way to play, though it doesn't involve another sideline, which allows us to move bishop f4. And normally against bishop f4 we want to respond to like bishop d6 to try to trade off the bishops, but in this position we're like kind of down a tempo if we try to do that, right? So yeah, this just leads to like different kinds of play, but knight f3 is the main move here, just trying to transpose into the normal Queen's Gambit. After knight f6, white plays bishop g5, and after castles, black can play h6 first and then castle, but it doesn't really change much. After castles, pawn to e3, and now pawn to h6. This is the idea. So white is faced with the decision here. If they want to take on f6, which is known as the Anti-Tartakower variation, saying that now, white has given up the bishop here, but at the same time, the bishop on f6 is kind of misplaced. Though this is definitely playable and very equal. We will look at a couple games in this line. Instead, the main move is bishop h4, simply retreating the bishop, maintaining the bishop pair, and in this position we will play the move pawn to b6. This is known as a Tartakower variation. So instead of that, there are other moves. For example, knight bd7 followed by c5 is one that is quite popular these days. Another move is the Lasker variation with knight e4, which is fully equalizing, but it becomes very dry a lot of the times. So it's like very drawish. Not a lot of people want to go into this. And so, but b6 here, just a bit about it. It's very solid, I believe, and I think it's underrated because nowadays you don't see this variation played like at the top level anymore. Just because I think white, or maybe rather, yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but perhaps black wants more of a fighting game and wants to try to fight for, try to imbalance the game and try to fight for a win. So maybe that's the reason why this move isn't played very often. But overall, it's a very solid move, and I think it's one of the easiest way for black to equalize in the Queen's Gambit. So in this position, there are a lot of moves that can be played. For example, the main moves are either bishop e2 or bishop d3. One other move is rook c1, just a waiting move, trying to say that I don't want to move this bishop on f1 yet. But in general, if black is able to get the bishop on b7 and they're able to fight for control over this long diagonal without a pawn landing on d5, such that your bishop is closed on b7 here, then black is generally doing very well. So for example, if white plays either bishop e2 or bishop d3, we'll simply take on c4, this is my recommendation, and go for bishop e7, where our bishop is open on this long diagonal. We will look into this a bit later, but the general idea is that black wants to maybe play a6, knight bd7, try to expand to b5, and then break in the center with c5. And black gets a really good game because the problem of the Queen's Gambit decline, the entire problem with this bishop, with this light square bishop is now essentially gone. So that's possible. Instead, in this position, it's also reasonable to take on d5. And the idea behind c6 d5 is that if we take back with the pawn, our bishop going to b7 really is blocked off by our own d5 pawn. So this is not very good. So seeing this, black will take on d5 with the knight, saying that at least we're trading off the bishops, which we know, like even in the exchange variation, this is quite favorable. We want to exchange the bishops because the pin is quite annoying, and after bishop takes e7, it's possible to take back with the knight, but the knight becomes quite misplaced here. You do open up the long diagonal, but at the same time, your knight on e7 is not looking great. It's definitely possible, but queen takes e7 is the main move, with the idea that after white takes on d5, he takes d5, the queen is controlling the e4 square and supporting some later c5 advances. Now, the problem behind this position is that, again, if the bishop lands on the b7 square, then it's blocked off by its own pawn. However, now since the other diagonal is open, the black bishop can often go to e6 to support the d5 pawn. So the main move here is to play the move rook c1, putting some pressure on the c-file. So now c5 is not possible because our d5 pawn will be attacked by the queen, which is why black here will play bishop e6, and white will play the move queen e4. This is the most testing move. And in this position, black's main move is to play c5. And this is very logical. Black wants to simply develop, increase the space advantage, and free up their position a bit. And in this position, it's possible to take on c5. But what ends up happening is that these hanging pawns are actually quite stable. For example, black has one typical idea here of going for pawn to a5, gaining more space, going for knight d7, and putting one of the rooks on b8. Normally the f rook goes to b8 here to put pressure on the weak b2 pawn. And black is accepted to have like very good counterplay with the open b file here. Despite the hanging pawns having a reputation of being quite difficult to handle, or could be like a big weakness, in this position it's like it's a very good version of it. So after c5, the main move here is queen e3, and this was seen actually in the famous game between Robert James Fischer against Boris Spassky. Fischer played this move against Spassky, and in this position, the idea is that the pawn is being pinned. So there are ideas here, obviously, of taking on c5, creating the hanging pawn structure, as well as making use of this pin with a possibility of knight d4 in the future. So in this position, rook c8 is necessary, just defending the c5 pawn. And from this position, there are already like two moves that are possible. White can play the calm move bishop e2, which is more solid and better, or the move bishop b5, which was chosen in the Fischer versus Spassky game. And in that game, it continued a6. Spassky played a6 here. and it doesn't actually do anything, which is why this is kind of a questionable move, because this pawn is being pinned anyways by the white queen. So this move didn't end up giving black anything, and after dc5, bc5, white managed to castle, and after the move rook a7 here, simply unpinning, white simply played bishop e2, and black had some problems here developing, because after knight d7, white played the move knight d4, targeting the e6 bishop, and after the queen comes back to f8, unpinning, white simply took on e6 and then played the move e4, which is very nice, because if you take on e4, which is the best move, you accept all of these weaknesses, clearly much better for white. But what ended up happening in the game is pawn to d4, and white played f4, followed by later bishop c4, and the bishop targets the e6 pawn. White has a big center, and white was much better here in a very beautifully played game by Bobby Fischer. So instead of a6 here, there's actually an improvement which is showed by Geller in this game, which continued queen b7, with the idea that you are sacrificing the c5 pawn, and there's a possibility of a6 right now, so you kind of need to take the pawn, if anything. Otherwise, bishop b5 doesn't make any sense. And once you take the pawn, black has the annoying move knight a6 here, with the idea that the queen actually has no safe square besides c6 to keep defending the bishop. So if you play queen c6 here, though, black will take on c6, and ideally you want to play a move like rook c8 to try to go rook c1, but white is just in time to play bishop a4 and meet this with bishop d1. And this position's equal after, let's say, rook a1, but it's not... yeah, there's a better move in this position, which is the move rook b8 first, with the idea that now if you play... okay, like, you're simply going to have to give up the b2 pawn, and maybe later even the a2 pawn, which gives black an advantage here, clearly. Because what ends up happening if you play b3 is that after rook c8, you no longer have the retreat with bishop a4 to d1, so black wins at least a piece here. I believe knight d4, and there's at least knight b4 here, yeah, with a fork on the attacking the bishop here. So yeah, essentially queen c6 is not great. So instead bishop takes a6, and after queen takes a6, the queen actually cuts on this long diagonal. So it's already very difficult for for white to play. a2 pawn is also hanging, open b file, and we see in this game after queen a3, trying to exchange the queens, black avoided the exchange of queens with queen c4, threatening queen c1 here with try to win the rook, and so white played king d2 in this position. But now this queen switches over to the king side, targeting the g2 pawn, and after rook g1, black played the very nice move d4, with the idea that after e takes d4, black will play a move like rook b8, and the king is simply way too open in this position. Bishop f5, queen e4, things like that, and the white king won't survive, which is why white ended up taking on d4 with the knight, which allowed queen h4 with a nice fork on h2 and f2. So rook e1, at least you don't want to lose the rook to a fork. Queen takes f2, rook e2, and queen f1, and just simply infiltrating on the back rank here with the rook coming in on the c or d file. White ended up taking on e6 here and playing queen d6, but now black plays in a very nice and calm move king h8, with the idea that if you take on e6, then rook d8 simply wins. So you can't really take the pawn on e6, which is why e4 was played, and in this position rook c8 was played, and this is good enough to win. Even e5 here was a better move, just seeing that you still can't take because of rook d8, and otherwise rook c8, queen c1, you're cutting out a lot of squares for the white king. So either way, rook c8 was played, king e3, rook f8, now switching the attack, rook d2, e5, queen takes e5, deflecting the queen from the d file, queen e1, check, check, rook d8, king c3, queen d1, queen b4, queen b5, queen d4, king c2, pawn to a6, which is a very nice move after luring the queen away. After queen takes a6, black played queen c5 here, which forced checkmate and resignation in this position. King b1, rook d1, king b3, rook b8 will lead to mate. So very nice game, and it kind of shows this improvement over the historic and very famous game, Game 6 of the 1972 World Championship match between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky. So this showed an improvement, and now we know that this line is no longer good with this bishop b5. Okay, now let's look at another game here played by Lars Schandorff on the black side against Curt Hansen. After d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, c4, e6, we entered the Queen's Gambit with a different move order, knight c3, bishop e7, bishop g5, castles, and now e3, pawn to h6, bishop h4, and now b6. Again, going to the main position of the Tartakower. And we will look again at the same line. Takes, 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 takes. Rook c1 now. Bishop e6, queen a4, pawn to c5, queen a3, rook c8. We saw this exact same position before, but now bishop e2. Definitely a better move and the main move. And in this position, it's definitely possible to play a lot of moves. For example, I also like the move king f8 here, simply unpinning. Which would allow this kind of pawn structure. And one of the black's main ideas is to play a5, knight d7, put the rook on b8, and then put some pressure on the b file. Even later, trying to go for the with this idea of pawn to c4, threatening to change the queens, so that later the b2 pawn becomes a big weakness. This is seen actually in a game played by Kasparov. Overall, this is a very good system. And also the main move here is to play the move a5, which is very interesting. With the idea that after white castles, black has the unpinning move queen a7. This is also a very interesting system, so I want to look at this and give you some options. So sometimes you can play this move, this system, sometimes you can play king f8, giving some extra options. Here dc5 is kind of forced, otherwise the pawn maybe advances to c4. So dc5, bc5, and now in the game rook c3 was played. This is actually already a bad move. Instead, knight e5 was necessary to prevent knight d7 from coming with big effect. Because there you could simply exchange off the knights. But instead knight c6 here is better. Now trading off the knights. After knight d3, for example, black can stick a knight on b4, blockading the position. And we see that one problem of the queen over on this side of the board is that it's kind of stranded. Here taking on b4 would be amazing for black with the open a file. So instead knight f4 was played, can be played queen b6 with the idea of putting the a rook to b8, followed by putting pressure on the b file. Again, it all surrounds the counterplay against this b pawn. For example, queen a4, rook a b8, and against bishop f3, black can simply play c4. And this is one key idea, as I mentioned before. You're simply gaining some extra space, and the c pawn can later advance forward if the b2 pawn is taken. And overall, it's a very dangerous pass pawn. But essentially, white is doing okay there, though black is one kind of fighting for an advantage. Instead, the move rook c3 was played, and black played knight d7, rook f to c1, and rook c to b8. So this is the entire idea, right? You want to put pressure on the b pawn. Knight e1 was played, trying to reroute their pieces, but now pawn to a4. So trying to fix the b pawn to stay there, and after knight d3, pawn to c4, knight to f4, queen to c5 was played in the game. Instead of queen c5 here, a better move would have been queen b6, simply targeting the b2 pawn. For example, after bishop f3, simply playing the move rook a5. Getting away from the long diagonal as well as defending the d5 pawn. And taking on e6 here would fix, defend the d5 pawn and give black a better structure. So rook 3 to c2 is possible, just defending the b2 pawn. But now after rook b5, the exchange here would be very favorable for black. Also, like I believe simply taking loses actually too. Even rook a5 here, I believe, just simply traps. That's possible, I believe. Rook a5 or even knight c5, queen a3. Yeah, maybe the queen escapes over here. So I believe maybe rook a5 simply wins. Either way, that's the possible line here. Instead of that, queen c5 was played, which allowed pawn to e4, and we entered this position with takes b2 and bishop f1. Instead of bishop f1, e takes d5 would have led to equality. Let's say here, pawn to h3, since now the knight is still defending the bishop, we don't want to, white doesn't want to lose it, so bishop e7, but now bishop takes e4, and we get a completely equal position. And this is what should have happened in the game. Instead, white played bishop f1 and actually gave black an advantage here. Instead of bishop d5, bishop d7 keeps all the trumps in the position. That would have been an improvement, but essentially this game ended in a draw. So that's all about the opening that I want to cover, kind of showing the possible middle game ideas, especially this idea of bringing the pawn to a5, a4, and the other pawn to c4, trying to target the b2 pawn. And so we see that actually, despite black having the weakness of the hanging pawns, the b2 pawn also becomes a significant weakness that white needs to be really careful to protect. The next game we're going to be looking at is a game played by Kiril Georgiev, again against Curt Hansen here. For c4, knight f6, knight c3, e6, we transpose quickly to the queen's gambit decline, and we enter the Tartakower variation. And now bishop d3. So here I don't really, even though this is one of the main moves, I don't really like this move because it allows d takes e4, bishop takes e4, and bishop e7. And simply we see a lot of positions in like the English and and in some inferior queens Indian positions, if white allows this, that if the bishop gets on the long diagonal unopposed, then it's generally doing quite well there. So white here typically castles, and then black plays knight bd7, white plays queen e2, simply developing, and now a6 here, preparing b5. In this position, rook ad1, but now black plays b5, bishop d3, and now a very nice move, knight d5 here. It's not the only move, but this is possible because we see that black's entire idea is that they want to exchange the bishops, and they also want to maybe exchange some knights off the board, which would ease black's task. For example, now if they play bishop g3, this is possible, and then c5, dc5, and now queen c8 here. These pawns are very weak, and black at least has equality here, if not slightly more. So instead of bishop g3, bishop takes e7 is best, but after queen takes e7, knight takes d5, and bishop d5, this bishop is really unopposed, and if white ever pushes e4 as we see in the game, this is already a positional concession because as a result, the bishop on d3 becomes kind of bad, and if white pushes e5 as seen in the game, then their entire center collapses here. So this is already very bad for white. Bishop e4 was played, that's white's idea, but after we trade, play pawn to c4, black also has a big majority, actually a 3-on-2 majority on the queen side here, and also access to the d5 square. So maybe knight b6, knight d5 is possible if allowed. Otherwise, these pawns are going to get rolling really soon. White is already struggling here. So instead, pawn to d5 was played, trying to allow this position, queen takes d5 and knight c5. Queen d6 here, trying to force the exchange of queens, but now black simply develops, rook f e8, defending the queen, rook d5, and now black plays the move knight d3. A very nice, a centralized knight on d3 here. b3, trying to chip away at the c4 pawn, but now black plays rook a c8 here, preparing, not only supporting the c4 pawn, but also preparing its advance at some point in the future. You can't take on e6 here because of knight b4, but the fork, that's important. Instead, b takes e4, bc4, g3 was played, and now queen b7, defending the pawn, getting the queen on this active file, and also on this long diagonal. Very nice. King g2, rook c to d8, forcing this exchange of two rooks for the queen. But now in this position, this pin is too much, and knight takes e5, rook 1 to d5, knight f3, king f3, and c3. And overall, this pawn is just too strong. So we see that this idea of the c pawn being a very big asset for black in these Tartakower variations. So rook d7 was played, queen c6, still maintaining the pin, rook d6, and now queen c4, rook d4, queen c8. After rook d8, queen c6 check. White simply resigned because this c pawn is simply running up the board. So even a very strong grandmaster, despite this being like kind of an old game, a very strong grandmaster could also fall into the crutches of the Tartakower. Next, let's look at a very serious try that white has here. After we enter the main position of the Tartakower again, b6, bishop e2. One of the main moves is also bishop b7. This is possible. Just want to give some additional ideas. And the main move in this position is to take on f6, which looks kind of strange because you move the bishop back to h4 and only now play bishop f6. But the idea is after this position, white will want to take on d5 and force the structure where the bishop is actually behind the d5 pawn. Now, this is a bit dangerous for black because white has the move b4, preventing pawn to c5. If white simply castles, then already knight d7 followed by c5 here, or the immediate c5 would have been very decent here at least. Trying to get the hanging pawns, and again with the very similar ideas. Maybe the b2 pawn becomes a weakness in the future. So instead of that, pawn to b4 here, with the idea of preventing c5. Now c5 is playable, and Kasparov has played this, but c6 is much more solid because oftentimes you don't want to allow getting the isolated pawn or d5. So c6 here was played by short. After white castles, now black plays a5. This is the idea. And now, one concern in this position is the main move pawn to b5. However, analysis showed that this is actually okay, though it is a bit uncomfortable. After pawn to c5, white can play knight e5. Now their knight is very centrally placed here. The pawn on d5 can be potentially weak. And after c takes d4, e takes d4, knight d7 here. Besides the move knight c6, which is quite playable, bishop c6, bc6, and knight b8. For example, c7, queen takes, knight takes d5, queen d8, rook to b1. This b6 pawn becomes a weakness, and white will be able to potentially win it, for example, or even just put some pressure on it. For example, rook a7, bishop f3, rook d7, knight takes f6, queen takes f6, and pawn to d5, rook f to d8. And we get this position where, okay, material is equal. The knight will later maybe go to a6 and c5, or maybe the rook blockades the d-pawn. And overall, this is just like an equal position because black is managing to blockade the pawn, but it's not a comfortable version of equality. This is like a forced, kind of a defending position where black is the one that has to suffer. So besides all the way over here, instead of knight c6, pawn to f4 is also quite unpleasant, though it does allow the sequence with knight takes e5. So overall, this line is a bit dangerous for black to enter, though it, according to theory or according to the computer analysis, this is perfectly playable. Instead, in the game, a3 was played, which allows knight d7, queen to b3, and now rook e8. And here, any captures in a5 here would be very good for black, just opening up the a file for the rook. White is not able to put a knight on e5, and overall black is doing quite well in this kind of position. So white kind of missed their opportunity there to play pawn to b5, trying to undermine black's structure. Instead, bishop d3 was played, but now a takes b4, and now knight f8. The knight is simply coming to e6 here to centralize. After rook f to d1, knight e6 was played, bishop to f1, and now queen to d6, simply improving the queen, knight to e1, trying to improve the knight, maybe to d3, and now pawn to h5 is a nice move. So the position objectively is equal, but it's clear to see that black is the one with the bishop here. First off, sooner or later it can open up, the position can open up, and black is also starting this h pawn advance. White plays g3, rook takes a1 was played, rook takes a1, and this actually allowed the tactic here, bishop takes d4. So this g3 move is kind of a mistake because it allowed this move. E takes d4, knight takes d4, queen to a3, with the idea that after rook e1, the f3 square is open for the fork. And we get this sequence, queen to a7, but after queen e7, white simply resigned here because there's nothing better to do. The white king is way too exposed, and black is also up 2 pawns, so nothing more to be played, and white resigned. So very nice game by short there. Let's look at another variation here, which is in the Anti-Tartakower variation. After we enter the main position of the Tartakower, h6, bishop f6. So now, as I mentioned before, the main point is that the bishop on f6 is kind of misplaced, and this bishop hasn't opened up. So white has a couple moves here. They can play a bunch of queen moves like queen c2, queen b3, queen d2 is possible, and also rook c1. Rook c1 is the main move. The idea behind queen d2 is actually quite interesting, is that white wants to actually castle long and launch the pawns up the board with h4 and g4 maybe. After queen d2, this is also quite challenging, but according to the games that I've seen, the cleanest equalizer is this move d takes e4, which is kind of strange because you're allowing the bishop to develop the c4 here with one go, but you don't really want to play, like c6 is possible here, but the idea behind this sequence is that if black wants to play c5, then they don't want to play c6 first, right? So they have to release the tension. They can play knight d7 followed by c5 next. And we're going to follow the footsteps of Kasparov here. After castles, pawn to c5, rook f to d1, and now c takes d4, knight takes d4. And in this position, all games have continued with the move knight b6 here. And after both bishop b3 and bishop e2, black is the one that's kind of I believe a bit struggling in this position because the knight on b6 is kind of like a bad piece. So instead, knight e5 is an improvement, which targets the bishop. The most logical square is to come back to e2, but now black plays bishop d7 and finishes development. Black here has ideas of queen b6. If the knight moves away from d4, then the bishop can come to c6 even. One idea is also that after queen b6, knight e4 is not possible because the bishop is covering that square. So after knight b3 here, black can play bishop c6, and the trade of queens here would be very very fine for black. Rook fd8. One interesting challenge is knight a5, trying to win the bishop pair back, but now black simply plays rook ac8, and is completely fine with equality here. If white doesn't take on c6, then simply their position is very solid here with the bishop pair. And if you play f4, for example, this is the best move, knight g6. Simply this position's equal. You know, you can trade on d8, you can take off the bishop, but this is nothing to write home about. And for example, if you play the move knight d4 back, besides coming back with bishop d7, going for the perpetual, even queen b6 here is a fine move, just maintaining equality. Knight c6, knight c6. Black has a good game here, even. You know, with his bishop on this long diagonal, I like black's chances. So that's the move queen d2, which is quite challenging, but as long as you know this move d takes c4, followed by knight d7 and c5, then you should be fine. Instead, the move rook c1 is played. This is the main move, just a waiting move. And in this position, I think it's actually important to play the move c6, simply defending the d5 pawn. Because at some point we want to take on c4, but we want to wait for the bishop to develop first. For example, bishop d3, we can take on c4 now, or we can play knight d7, and white can castle. And then black can play dc4, followed by c5, here, or e5 even. c5 or e5 are both playable, I believe, with a fine position. But instead h2 is played here in this game, which, you know, is just simply a waiting move. Black continued knight d7, and white played, I believe, a slight inaccuracy here with cd5, because after e takes d5, we essentially enter the Carlsbad structure, but black is owned with the bishop pair. So they've gotten exactly what they wanted here. You know, Carlsbad, bishop pair, what more could you ask for? Bishop d3, and now rook e8. Simply lining up the rook on the e-file. White castles, finishes development, and now black plays a5 here. Takes the time to prevent pawn to b4, the typical minority attack idea. And here white played a3, preparing maybe at some point to play b4, but now black plays bishop e7, simply covering the b4 square. White played queen c2, normal developing. Black reroutes the bishop to d6, improving its position on this diagonal, and now white breaks with e4. So they accept an isolated pawn here, but they want to try to win the bishop on d6 here. But one typical idea is that black can simply play knight f6 and allow white to take on d6, because at the end of the day they have this weakness on d4. And we'll see how black actually is already having a slight advantage in this position and is able to convert this game. After queen c5, rook to d8, putting some pressure on the d-file, rook f to e1, queen takes c5, since now d takes c5 is no longer possible since the bishop on d3 is hanging. So rook c5, bishop e6, and black is simply going to blockade the d5 square, preventing the d pawn from advancing, and this just becomes a weakness. So let's see how this masterclass of a game was played. Rook c to e5, king f8, bishop c2, rook to d6, preparing to double up maybe, g4, knight d7, even kicking away the rook, rook e3, now knight b6. So the knight is looking for more squares to try to occupy. Bishop b3. Okay, we don't really want to exchange the bishops here, as well as, you know, activate the rook on the b3 square. So knight d5 it is. Rook to e5, knight to f4. Simply, we want to exchange pieces if we are fighting against the isolated pawn. So bishop e6, knight e6, rook 1 to e4, pawn to a4, fixing the queen side here. Very nice move. King g2, and now rook a6. So simply black is going to play rook b6 next and target the b2 pawn. And there are just like too many weaknesses in white's position to be able to hold this. h4, rook b6, g5, rook takes b2, pawn to g6, trying to create a mess of the position. But now black plays rook b5, threatening to exchange the rooks off. Pawn to h5, king e7, rook to g4, and now pawn to f6. The rook either needs to exchange or needs to retreat. So rook e1 it is. And now rook takes h5. And simply, we see this position, black is simply winning here, right? We're up 2 pawns. Yeah, nothing more to be said about the position. So yeah, that's just all I want to cover from this game. Let's look at another game in the Anti-Tartakower. So we get the main position again. Now bishop f6, castles, rook c1, c6, bishop d3, knight d7, castles. And now this is the idea, is that after black has played knight c6 and knight d7, black is ready to take on c4, and then play the move c5, just opening up the position. White played queen e2, and now a6 here. So in this position, it's possible to either prevent the pawn from coming to b5, or to take on c5 immediately. This is one of the ideas. If you play rook fd1, we will simply transpose into, I think, a very similar variation as we saw before. C takes c4, knight d4, and even here queen a5 I very much like, or even queen e7. Queen a5 maybe runs into knight b3, so maybe queen e7, knight e5, b5, bishop e7, and black gets a really good game here. So instead of rook fd1 here, pawn to e4 is an interesting move, and I think in this position it's actually important not to take on d4. It's important to play queen e5 immediately. Now it's because if we play c takes d4, white can take on d4 with the pawn, not with the knight. And what ends up happening is that they get the open e-file, so later they can continue with this idea of bringing a rook into the game. Rook e1, rook e3, rook g3. Or even knight e4, rook c3, and then bring the other rook on the side of the board. This is a very dangerous position. For example, queen a5, which makes sense, just developing the queen. Rook f to d1, knight b6, trying to blockade the d-pawn. Knight e4, bishop e7, bishop b3. Now, for example, a normal move looks like bishop, or like knight takes a4, for example, just winning a pawn. But after knight e5, white gets a big initiative here because the c8 bishop is unable to develop. Knight b6, now rook d3. And if you look at this position, it's already like quite miserable actually, because white is the one getting the free attack for no reason at all. So that's why c takes d4 here is releasing the tension is not very good, and why queen a5 is a better move. Yeah, so after rook fd1, black can play now rook d8, simply developing knight to e4, bishop comes back to e7, yeah, potentially b6, bishop b7 is possible here, or even knight b6 on the next move. So dc5, knight takes e5, rook takes d8, bishop d8, knight c5, queen c5, and it's not possible to take advantage of this pin quite yet, or this x-ray. So queen d2, defending the rook, attacking the bishop, so now queen e7, and now black actually has already slight advantage here, I believe, because of the bishop pair, the target on a4 here. For example, black can continue with like bishop d7. If allowed, they want to go bishop c6. If not, they can simply go bishop e8 to consolidate their pieces, go rook c8 next, and enjoy the bishop pair in this kind of position, which is why I believe a4 is not the best move to prevent b5, which is why white should actually take on c5 here, allowing knight takes c5. But after pawn to b4, black actually b4 is not forced here. For example, you can play rook fd1, queen e7, and enter another position, but instead pawn to b4 is played, very forcing. But black came up with a nice solution here to take on c3, rook takes c3, and now knight e4, hitting the rook, so rook c2, and now pawn to b5 followed by bishop e7. And in general, we see that if the bishop is staying on this long diagonal, it's generally like a very good piece, and it's difficult for white to combat this bishop. So the nice thing about the knight on e4 is also it's blockading the possibility of the e4 pawn for the e3 pawn to advance. Rook fc1 is played, knight f6, pawn to e4. But even if white gets an e4, it's not like it's solving all of black's problems, because yeah, at the end of the day, the bishop on d3 is blocked, and so if they want, they have to push e5 again to open up the bishop. But then black gets the square on d5 for the knight. So here queen b6 is simply developing, preparing the ideas of maybe playing pawn to a5 in the future. And so after rook c3, immediately black played the move a5. And here, what would have been best is to play the move rook c5, which is not very, which is possible here. And after ab5, rook takes b5 and queen a6, yeah, targeting the a2 pawn maybe. For example, rook takes b5, now queen a3 even, hitting both rooks. So this forces rook c to b1, now bishop a6. And once the bishops have been exchanged, black is able to hold this position despite being a pawn down currently, because the e4 pawn is a target, a2 pawn is also a target. After rook 1 to b2, black can play rook a4, trying to trade off the rooks, and this would be very easy draw. e4, let's say knight d5, and yeah, the a pawn is simply not making any progress. So instead of that, rook 4 to b3 is played, can be played, but then now queen c5, and simply the a pawn again isn't advancing, so black can put pressure on it. Black can also put pressure on the e pawn, and is getting a fine game here. That's if rook c5, but instead that would lead to equality. But instead, b takes a5 was played, which is already a mistake, because after rook takes a5, the a2 pawn suddenly becomes very weak, and it becomes a target with tempo as well against the queen. So now rook b3, queen to a7, very nice. Rook to c2, defending the a pawn, and now an improvement, I believe, in this game would have been the move rook d8, because now you still can't take on b5 here, since after you trade everything, the e4 pawn falls, right? And then white is left with a weak a2 pawn. For example, h3, and then now rook a4 even, preparing to trade off some the b5 pawn for the e4 pawn, because at the end of the day, this pawn is very important. Instead, rook a4 was played in the game. Now rook takes b5, bishop takes e4, bishop takes, rook takes, now queen d3. After rook a4, it's clear to see that black has the advantage here because the e2 pawn becomes weak, and we'll see how Nakamura actually managed to convert this. Queen b3, knight d5, pawn to h3, rook to a3, queen to c4, and now rook to a8. After rook b to b2, queen to a4, black is trying to exchange the queens maybe so that this pawn on a2 becomes weakness, but this obviously like isn't a win for black. This should be theoretically a draw, though even if black wins the e2 pawn, but it's not like a fun draw to have to hold for like 50 moves or something. So instead, white played queen c5, queen to f4 was played, rook to c4, queen to f6, and in this position, black is left with the final opportunity to actually, white is left with the final opportunity to actually equalize here. The b2 rook is being hit, so now rook b8 is actually forced, deflecting the rook here, so that now the a3 rook can be taken. But in this position, black can actually, it looks fairly equal. Black can actually start creating some initiative here with pawn to g5. Even rook b1 is possible before. And overall, it's black who's like kind of like trying to fight for an edge, though it's closer to equality than it is for a black win. Instead, rook c to c2 was played, which allowed knight f4. Instead of knight f4, actually the immediate rook takes f3 would have been very nicely winning. Gf3 and then now knight f4. Threat of queen g6 is possible. So king f1, rook to d8, cutting out white's escape squares, and after rook to b1, covering the back rank as well. Queen to g6 here simply wins with the threat on g2. It's unstoppable. So yeah, that would have been a nice finish of the game. Instead, knight f4 was played, and eventually black managed to like win a pawn here with knight takes f3, and is able to convert this position quite handily. So yeah, that's all I want to show from this game and overall in the Tartakower variation. If you have any questions, feel free to comment those down below. Now, yeah, let's move on to the next one, which is the bishop f4 queen's gambit. So in the next game here, we will be looking at a game between Magnus Carlsen and Vasily Ivanchuk, the Ukrainian legend. After we enter the main position of the queen's gambit declined, bishop e7, we'll be looking at this move bishop f4. Now, this is something that is, I think, very, it's something that has like gained a bit more popularity ever since bishop g5 was discovered to be very equal in a lot of lines. So bishop f4 is definitely something you should be ready for. And here black should just castle, and after pawn to e3, there are like a lot of systems that black can go for. They can go for knight bd7 followed by c5, or go for b6 right now, consistent with the Tartakower, but it's kind of an inferior version, which is why in this position I like to play the move pawn to c5, because the move c5 here actually threatens to create an isolated pawn position for white here. And with the bishop on f4, this is a much worse, or like a slightly worse position for the bishop than if it was on g5. If white wants to accept the isolated pawn. If white wants to accept the isolated pawn, essentially the bishop is better coming to g5. And so here after c5, it creates a lot of tension, which is why white essentially has to take on c5, not to allow the isolated pawn position. After, let's say, bishop takes c5, here the main move is a3 or queen c2. They can generally transpose. If white takes on d5 here with the pawn, then after, we generally want to accept this like isolated pawn structure, but why not exchange a set of pieces along the way? Knight takes d5, e5, black gets an h6, bishop e6. There's already the threat of bishop e4 right now, misplacing the king. So white can play a3, for example, and then black can play knight c6 here, and just develop normally h6, maybe bishop e6, queen b6, target some pawns, and black is getting a very fine game here with equal chances. Instead, a3 in this position is the main move, which we'll be looking at after knight c6. This will transpose, but instead queen c2 here, with the idea that after black plays knight c6, white, black is at any point ready to accept an isolated pawn here, which is why the knight belongs on c6, so that it can later, support maybe an advance of pawn to d4, or even just it's generally more useful to blockade, to control the center here than on d7. Yeah, and so here white's main move is a3, and black will play the move queen a5, preventing pawn to b4, And so in this position, there's also like a couple moves. The idea of queen a5 is not only to like prevent pawn to b4, but also there's the idea of playing knight to e4, making use of the spin, trying to double the pawns. And so here, white can play the move rook d1, which prepares or threatens pawn to b4. But I like the move bishop e7, simply getting out of the way. White can play bishop e2, which is the main move. And now knight e4. And I believe that we exchange to complete equality here. After cd5, knight c3, bc3, e takes d5, castles, and now the simple move pawn to h6. And black can simply play a move like bishop f6 to target the c3 pawn, play rook d8, defending the d5 pawn. And this is very equal, as shown in course 1's play. Instead of rook d1 here, white can also castle, but now they can't play pawn to b4. But again, I like the move bishop e7 here. Simply retreating from any possibilities, also defending the d5 pawn since it was under attack. And now white can play h4 here. This was played in the game. And now black can play rook d8, simply defending the pawn. And black is not without counterplay themselves. After knight d2, potentially maybe threatening knight b3, black played a6 here. With the clear idea that they want to play b5, but I think that was somehow misevaluated by Carlsen, which he played bishop e2 and allowed b5. And now taking on b5 would be very, like, essentially suicidal because you're opening up the b file and a file as well. So instead, c takes d5 was played, but e d5, pawn to g4, going for an aggressive counterattack. But now bishop e6, knight to b3, queen to b6, pawn to g5, and now knight e4. So this is important, you know. We want to lunge forward. We want to trade off the knight on c3, which is defending the white king. And black's position is already much better here already. Knight e4 is played, d4, rook takes d8, knight takes d8, king to b1, rook to c8 with tempo, queen to d1. Okay, I mean, you can take the pawn on... you can actually take the pawn on e4 here because the knight on b3 is hanging. So queen to d1, knight to c6, simply developing, pawn to h5, and now pawn to a5. And simply... white's attack is too slow here because all black's pieces are aimed at the white king, and their pawns are also rushing forward. Pawn to g6, now pawn to a4. Knight d2, pawn to b4, and now simply black breaks through. G takes f7 was played, but now simply bishop takes f7, knight c4, queen to b7, getting out of the way. Queen takes a4, but now b takes a3, knight a3, bishop takes a3, going for this exchange, which allows the knight to come into the position. And simply... white doesn't have enough defenders of the king. So b3 was played, but now knight d3. After bishop takes d3, e3, rook c1 was played, but now d2. And white simply resigned in this position. So we see that, even like in this kind of position, a lot of the ideas in the Tartakower also apply in this kind of position. For example, the possibility of the pass pawn on the D or C files. The structure is quite similar in a lot of positions, and so we can apply the various ideas into other lines. So yeah, let's look at the last game here, which is played by Topalov against Nakamura. And we enter again the main position of the bishop f4, queen's gambit decline. And in this position, a3 was played. And it's actually interesting because why does white not play e3? Now, I think actually a3 is kind of a slower move, so we can actually take advantage of it. We can play pawn to b6 in this position and get a better version of the the Tartakower essentially, because normally black isn't allowed the option of going b6 followed by c5 so early on, and in this position after pawn to e3, it's immediately possible to play pawn to c5. This is necessary because after bishop b7, this actually allows white to get everything they want. You can take on d5, bishop d5, let's say, and bishop d3, with the idea of like queen c2, targeting this guy, and also after c5, they also have the opportunity to take on c5. For example, bishop c5 already loses to bishop h7, and then knight g5 here. That's already winning. And like if you play bc5, then you're accepting a weak pawn here, and white can play queen c2, creating some weaknesses on your king side. So, which is why overall in this position, the idea behind black's playing b6 is that they actually want to support the advance with c5. And we know that with the bishop on f4, they're not ideally coordinated to actually accept the isolated pawn, which is why dc5 is possible here. But after bc5, bishop e2, and bishop b7, black has equal fighting chances in this position with queen b6, rook d8, and despite later getting the hanging pawn structure, they get like some pretty nice bishops on this diagonal. This bishop is controlling everything, defending the c5 pawn, holding black's position together. And so black gets a really good play here. That's the idea of white plays a3 early on. But again, c5 here can transpose into the main variation as we saw before. dc5, bishop takes c5, e3, knight c6, and we simply transpose. cd5 was played in this game, and we will actually see why this the sequence that Topalov chose is not correct. After e takes d5 here, better is to move bishop e2, but this will allow the move pawn to d4. And after, let's say, knight e4, black will play bishop e6, and despite giving up the dark-squared bishop here, this will lead to equality after knight takes d4 and rook d8. Yeah, white will, okay, like black will be able to win back the pawn. Let's say queen c2, takes, now bishop e6. Sooner or later, we'll take the d4 pawn. But for now, we just want to simply focus on development, put a rook on c8. Later, we can take the d4 pawn. And despite white having like the bishop here, which you might argue for, yeah, black has some really centralized pieces and also a lead in development, and later is able to get the rook centralized on d8 and c8 here. So black is doing fine here. Instead, in the game, pawn to b4 was played, which is very ambitious, which allowed actually the move pawn to d4. And the thing is that after e takes d4, which is played in the game, yeah, black is getting an advantage. But if you play knight a4, then after bishop e7, knight takes d4, we see the problem behind this move pawn to b4 is that black can go for the very nice move, knight takes b4 now. Let's say a b4, bishop takes b4. This is already like deadly. King e2, pawn to b5. Pawn to b5 here looks very reasonable, or even b6 followed by bishop a6. Yeah, a lot of moves here look very decent. Even knight e5. Yeah, very dangerous for the white king. So instead of knight a4, e takes d4 is played. But now after bishop takes d4, knight e4, knight e4, bishop e3, black played the move knight f5 here. And turns out, despite giving white the bishop pair right now, there will be a weakness created on e3 here, because after takes and takes, if white plays an active move like bishop f4, they're running into problems after rook e8, and then now bishop e7, simply developing. And if you castle, then rook ac8 actually wins some material because you're attacking two pieces here. If you play rook c1, you know, black will simply take and then take the bishop, winning some material. So you can't play an active move like bishop f4, which is why white played bishop e2, which actually allowed this exchange and, you know, white getting this weak e3 pawn. Knight g4 was played, targeting it, e4, bishop e6, castles, knight e3, rook f to c1, now rook d2, activating the rook. And in this position, bishop f3 was played, rook a to d8, simply doubling up, pawn to e5, trying to open up the bishop's diagonal, now pawn to b6. So this pawn on c4 on e5 can actually become weak, maybe to move like knight c4 in the future. Knight e4 is played, rook to b2, potentially, you know, getting away from the attack, and also potentially at some point doubling up on the second rank if allowed. Rook to e1, and in this position a better move would have been the move rook b3, with the idea that after knight g5, simply play bishop c4. This would have still maintained black's advantage, though in the game knight c4 is played, which allowed equality after knight g5, h6, takes, rook a to c1, and for the longest time in this game, after this moment, yeah, white is managing to get equality after, for example, rook d4, h3, pawn to b5. Even though this is putting a pawn on the light square, it is fixing the structure here. Rook to c3, rook to d2, and we see that yeah, the rooks are actually doubled on the second rank, which is one of the ideas. Pawn to a4, pawn to a6, bishop b7 targeting the a pawn, and now knight b7, knight b6 here targeting the a4 pawn, which is what compelled white into taking on b5, playing bishop e4, and now knight c4 again. So now there's this weak pawn on b4, and even though this position is, I believe, still equal, yeah, this position is still equal, it's kind of unpleasant to play. After rook g3, rook to e2 was played, and now rook a1 was played, which is a big mistake. I believe instead taking on e2 would have been better. Yeah, I believe that, yeah, rook e2, or even king f1, I believe, is maybe even better. King f1, knight d2 actually runs into some problems, maybe. Yeah. No, rook e2 here is correct, yeah. I guess the idea is bishop d3, takes, and then takes. Something like this should be equal. Yeah. Yeah, which is why Black should have gone into white should have gone into this, but instead they played rook a1, which allowed knight takes e5, rook a1, rook a8 here, king f7, and the idea of white's play is to play bishop h7, trying to attack the black king and like cut out some squares. But after g5 here, black is very safe and is already controlling the entire board. This b4 pawn is also going to fall. Bishop g8 was played, king f6, rook f8, king g7, rook to e8, knight to g6, bishop takes e6, and then now knight f4. And white simply threw in the towel here because sooner or later these rooks will be exchanged and the b4 pawn will fall, and this pass pawn is very powerful and is simply going to win black the entire game. So I hope you enjoyed this coverage of the Queen's Gambit declined and a lot of the possible deviations already from as early as like move 3. Yeah, I hope you learned a thing or two. As you can see, this Tartakower variation, as well as the lines I recommend in the Bishop f4 Queen's Gambit, as well as the exchange variation, are very solid. There are a lot of ideas in them, dynamic, and provide black also with like some fighting chances to fight for the win. So hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.